my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am doing my anticipated releases for the second half of the year 2022. These are science fiction and fantasy titles, mostly adult, with a few young adult and middle grade books mixed in. As always with these lists, all of the information about these books and their release date is subject to change. Publication dates can get pushed back, cover art can change, books can get cancelled altogether. It happens. In line with the fact that publication dates can and do change, there are a couple books that are going to get a shout out on this list that were on my list for the first half of the year and that have now been pushed back to the second half of the year. I'm also including in this list a number of titles that were originally self-published, that have been around for a while, that are now getting new releases from traditional publishers. And finally, before we get going, because this is a very long list, my final disclaimer is that, as with all of my anticipated releases lists, I give absolutely no guarantee that I personally will read any of these books. These are all things that are on my personal radar. It's not necessarily the most hyped anticipated books of the second half of the year. There will be some very high-profile releases that I'm of course aware of that are not on this list, but that doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to read or review everything or anything that's on this list. This is a resource for you. Starting off with July, my first book on this list is A Prayer for the Crown Shy by Becky Chambers. This is the second book in the Monk and Robot series, which might be finished after just 2 books. It might be a duology, but I'm not totally sure about that. This will continue the story of the T-Monk sibling Dex and the robot Mosscap. These books are novellas, and this comes out on July 12th from Tor.com. Moving on, my next book is one of those ones that was on my previous list for the first half of the year and got pushed back. The Stone Road by Trent Jamieson is now scheduled for release on July 19th. From Erewhon Books. This is a fantasy novel, and while we're on this one, I want to point out that Erewhon Books is also publishing a new edition of a previously self-published book by this same author that I think might be set in the same world, and that is Dayboy. This was originally self-published in 2015. It's getting this beautiful new cover, and this is going to be published on August 23rd. This is a vampire thing, and I think this one might honestly be too horror for me, but because Erewhon seems to be marketing these as companion novels, I wanted to give this a shout out alongside The Stone Road. Next, on July 19th from Del Rey is The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is a book set in 19th century Mexico based on the island of Dr. Moreau, which is one of those classics that I've never read and I'm not particularly inclined to, but I still might want to read this book anyways, even having not read the source material. Silvia Moreno-Garcia experiments with a lot of different genres in her writing. She describes this one as historical science fiction. Next, I'm going to mention another self-published series that I've been interested in for a while that are getting new releases from Orbit, and this is the Regency fairy tale series by Olivia Atwater. The first book, Half a Soul, got its traditionally published release back at the end of June, and then the book that's coming out in July is book 2. This is 10,000 Stitches. This releases on July 19th, and then the third book, Long Shadow, is getting its Orbit release on August 16th. These are historical fantasy Regency romances. I think the romance in these books leans mild as opposed to spicy. And I've been seeing these pop up on lists of like Fantasy of Manners and historical fantasy romance and stuff for long enough now that I've definitely become interested. Next on my list is A Strange and Stubborn Endurance by Meadows. This is coming on July 26th from Tor Books. This is a queer fantasy romance with an arranged political marriage and all of the complicated politics that come with it. Next on July 26th, we have A Half-Built Garden by Ruthanna Emrys. This is from Tor.com. This is the author who wrote Wintertide and Deep Roots, which were Lovecraft-inspired, Lovecraft subversion books that I remember seeing a good deal about when they were released, even though I never read them. This is something very different. This is a science fiction first contact story about what happens when aliens come to Earth to try to save us from our dying planet, but some people would rather stay and try to save the planet instead of being swept away to the stars. Next, also on July 26th, I actually think this is the third in a row now that's been July 26th, is The Book of Gothel by Mary McMyne. As both the title and the cover strongly suggest, this is a Rapunzel retelling that's focused on the witch. I will admit to having been personally put off by some of the marketing I've seen for this book. It's been, a lot of it has been like, but did you know the real story of Rapunzel's witch? And when marketing of a retelling takes that approach, like, the real story behind the fairy tale, I always end up being like, well, I've read 3 retellings that do that already. You haven't told me why yours is different. That said, some of the early reviews I've seen for this are actually very encouraging. So I am in fact tempted to put aside my judgment on the marketing and give this one a go. I think it's using a historical setting, but I'm not actually sure what the historical setting is. Anyways, this one is being published by Red Hook. And then next on my list is The Bruising of Qilwa by Naseem Jamina. This is coming out on August 9th from Tachyon Publications. I think it's a novella. This is set in a queer normative Persian-inspired world. It features a refugee protagonist who is a blood magic practitioner, and they have to solve a medical mystery to figure out what is causing the mysterious new illness that is plaguing this city. Next is another novella also coming out on August 9th. This is High Times in the Low Parliament by Kelly Robson, and this one is from Tor.com. This looks like a fantasy political satire about dysfunctional government with a protagonist who is a scribe for the parliament. This also promises to have fairies and lesbians. Next, also on August 9th, is The Monsters We Defy by Leslye Penelope. This is coming out from Orbit. This is the author's first book under this name, but this is not a debut author. She's published a number of books previously under the name L. Penelope, most notably the Earthsinger Chronicles, which is a series that I've heard some good things about. This one is a historical fantasy novel set in Washington, D.C. in the 1920s. And the book description says that it weaves together African-American folk magic, history, and romance. I think there is a daring heist. Next, on August 23rd, also from Orbit, is The Undertaking of Hart and Mercy by Megan Bannen. So this is a very cute-looking fantasy romance novel that also has zombies. This is like a secondary fantasy world that has zombies. But this also looks like really cute and fluffy, and like, I don't know if I decide to read this, if the cute and fluffy will outweigh the zombies for me or not. This just seems very unusual, so I wanted to have it on the list. The second book I've got for August 23rd is Babel by R.F. Kuang. This is coming out from Harper Voyager. The Goodreads listing for this book gives it a very long subtitle. The full title on Goodreads is Babel, or the Necessity of Violence, an Arcane History of the Oxford Translators Revolution. But if you look at the cover art that's been released, all the title there is on the cover is Babel, an Arcane History, which makes me think that the subtitleage has been revised and that no one changed it on Goodreads. But this is a historical fantasy about academia and translation, so I'm very intrigued. I did like The Poppy War when I read it, which was the first book in R.F. Kuang's previous trilogy. I did mean to continue on with that series, but I was just never in the mood. So at this point, since it's been so long since I read the first book in that series, I'm more likely to pick up this new book of Kuang's than to continue on with The Dragon Republic. And then the third book due on August 23rd that I have on this list is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. This, I have to admit, the thing that catches my eye most immediately about this book is its title. What an incredible title. This is a contemporary fantasy about a witch who is summoned to a mysterious place called Nowhere House, where she's asked to teach 3 young witches. There's also a handsome librarian, and romance ensues. It looks very cute. The publisher for this one is Berkeley. Next, we have the second book that is a repeat from my list for the first half of the year that has been pushed back. This is A Taste of Gold and Iron by Alexandra Rowland. The new publication date for this is August 30th from Tor.com. This is a queer fantasy romance between a prince and his bodyguard, and I think there's going to be a lot of economics. The next book I have on my list is both the first YA book to show up in this video and also a book that unfortunately has a dramatically different publication date between the UK and US editions. So the UK edition of Unraveler by Frances Hardinge is coming on September 2nd from Macmillan Children's Books. This is a YA fantasy about someone who has the magical power to unravel curses. There is not that much more information than that in the book description, but Frances Hardinge is always an interesting writer, so releases of hers will always be on my radar. Unfortunately, here in the US, we don't get it until January of next year, and we are going to have to settle for this significantly less pretty cover design. Next, on September 13th from Harper Voyager, we have Brindlepunk Bruja by Desideria Mesa. This is another historical fantasy novel. I feel like we're getting a lot of historical fantasy in the second half of 2022, and I'm excited about it. This is set in Kansas City in the 1920s, and it's inspired by Mexican folklore, and this is a debut novel. Next, on September 20th, from Tachyon Publications, we have The Unbalancing by R.B. Lemberg. This is the first full-length novel in their Birdverse universe, in which they've written a number of short stories and also the novella The Four Profound Weaves, which I've had on my TBR for a really long time. I've had it recommended to me by people who know my taste very well, and I continue to be embarrassed that I haven't read The Four Profound Weaves yet. But this one I've seen described as a queer Atlantis thing. I'm very intrigued. Next, on September 20th, more historical fantasy. See, I told you, there is so much of it. This is The Witch and the Tsar by Olesya Salnikova-Gilmore, and this is being published by Ace. This pits the witch Baba Yaga against Ivan the Terrible in a struggle for the fate of 16th century Russia. This is another debut novel. I hope it's as good as it looks. Next, okay, we have another mini trend, because this is the first of 2 books on this list that looks like a charming whodunit murder mystery in space. And this is Station Eternity by Mer Lafferty. This is listed as the first book in a series called The Mid-Solar Murders. I know Six Wakes had also like a murder mystery element to it, but that was all of the reviews of that I saw described it as a sort of darker thriller type of thing. And so I didn't think that one was going to be for me, but this seems a lot more lighthearted. This one seems to be genre aware in a really fun way. The protagonist is an amateur detective who, like amateur detectives in all of the mystery series, just like happens to have murders happen around her all the time. So she goes to a space station to try to get away from all the murders, but oh no, murder happens on the space station. Next is, I believe, the only middle grade title on this list, and it is also the only book on this list that doesn't yet have a cover for either the American or UK editions. This is Silverborn, The Mystery of Morrigan Crow. This is the 4th book in the Nevermore series. This is my favorite ongoing middle grade series. I think it's the only ongoing middle grade series that I'm like actively caught up with. And this might actually be my #1 most anticipated book of the second half of the year. These books are charming and funny and thoughtful, super whimsical, very creative, great characters. And the ending of book 3 promised a very dramatic book 4. This is a series that has previously, with some of the prior books, had a significant gap between the UK release and the United States release, but that is not happening with this one. The US publisher is Little Brown Books for Young Readers, and we're getting it on October 10th, which is approximately the same date as when everyone else is getting it, give or take a bit. And just to be clear, we don't have cover art yet for either edition. Next is the second whodunit murder mystery in space that I have on this list. This is The Spare Man by Mary Robinette Kowal, and this is coming on October 11th from Tor Books. This is about an inventor and heiress who is traveling incognito on a spaceship for her honeymoon. Unfortunately, the romantic getaway is interrupted by a murder which needs to be solved. Next, on October 25th, we have Into the Riverlands by Ni Vo, which is the third novella in the Singing Hills cycle. The first one was The Empress of Salt and Fortune, which I really loved. I've not yet read the second book, which was When the Tiger Came Down the Mountain, but this is the third story to follow the adventures of the traveling cleric Chi, who records stories wherever they go. The second book I have here for October 25th is Strike the Zither by Joan He. This is a young adult title from Roaring Brook Press, and unlike this author's first two YA novels, which were Descendant of the Crane and The Ones We're Meant to Find, which were both standalones, this is the first in a duology inspired by Three Kingdoms, which is a classic of Chinese literature. So I know this is fantasy. I'm not sure if it's historical or if it is a secondary world, and I'm not personally familiar with the source material, but after reading The Ones We're Meant to Find, I'm definitely going to be interested in anything this author writes. Okay, so next we have a long string of really exciting books all coming out on November 1st. Like, if I had to pinpoint one release day in the coming 6 months that, like, oh, this is the day when all the books are happening, it's November 1st. The first I want to mention is another YA book and another beautiful cover by Kuang. And this is Sea Sparrow, which is the 5th Graceling Realm book by Kristin Cashore, picking up after the events of Winterkeep. I really loved Winterkeep. I thought it was a great return to this world and this series, opening it up even further. And I really, truly cannot wait for this book. This one is going to focus on the character of Hava, and the publisher for this one is Dutton Books for Young Readers. Next, also November 1st, this one from Green Willow Books is another entry in a beloved YA series. This is a story collection. It's Moira's Pen, A Queen's Thief collection by Megan Whalen Turner. If you watch me here on this channel, you know that I have been gradually making my way through the Queen's Thief series and that I absolutely love them. This, as advertised, is a collection of stories set in the Queen's Thief universe. I don't know how much of what's going to be in this is going to be things that have been previously published and how much of it, if any, is going to be new material, but you bet I'll be buying it and reading it once I finish the main series. I am a bit perplexed that this has a notably different cover design from the newer editions of all of the rest of the series. Like, they went for a really distinctive look for those books for the new editions, and this is not ugly by any means, but this is very, very different. The next November 1st book I have on this list is Ocean's Echo by Everina Maxwell, which is coming out from Tor Books. This is set in the same world as her first novel, Winter's Orbit, but set in a different part of this space opera universe and following totally different characters. Like Winter's Orbit, this is an romance. This one has some, like, mind-reading, forced psychic bond stuff going on in the premise that honestly makes me think I might not like this one as much, just based on, like, romance tropes I tend to like versus romance tropes I tend to dislike. But this could totally prove me wrong. I'm willing to give it a try. Next, still on November 1st, more queer romance, more historical fantasy. This is A Restless Truth by Freya Marsk. This is the second book in the last Binding series, the first of which was A Marvelous Light. I think there's maybe going to be a third book in this series, like it's maybe going to be a trilogy. I might be totally wrong though. But again, historical fantasy. This is Edwardian England with all sorts of hidden secret magic. This is an FF romance. This is Maud's book. She's the younger sister of Robin from book 1. And this one, I understand, takes place primarily at sea on a boat. Okay, last book for November 1st, I promise. The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin. I told you November 1st is a big day in sci-fi fantasy publishing. This is the second book in the Great Cities series. The first one was The City We Became. I read The City We Became and still I feel like I have no idea what to expect from this second book. It's been a while in the making. This is a contemporary urban fantasy. The first book followed a group of characters who became the living avatars of the city of New York. Presumably, we will learn what happens to them next in book 2. On November 8th from Tor.com, we have Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This is a novella. I don't know if this is going to be a standalone or if this will maybe have sequels, but this is a supernatural noir. Again, this is queer. I don't know if it's like romance though. I've read all of C.L. Polk's books so far and I've liked all of them. This looks kind of different, but they're an author I trust, so I do think I will try to read this. Also on November 8th from Tor.com is a really interesting looking anthology. This is Africa Risen, a new era of speculative fiction, edited by Cherie Renee Thomas and Oganachowe Donald Epeki. As the title indicates, this is an anthology of science fiction and fantasy from African writers and writers of the African diaspora. There are a couple of names I recognize on the list of authors for this anthology, but mostly it's authors I have never heard of. So I think this anthology is probably going to introduce a lot of new authors to a bunch of readers. Okay, we're getting very close to the end here. The second to last book I want to talk about is another one that's a self-published title that's getting a traditionally published re-release. This one has been getting a lot of love on Book Talk lately, and honestly, I can see why. It looks utterly and completely charming. This is Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldry. This was first self-published back in February of this year, but now it has been picked up by Tor. The ebook has already shifted over to the new Tor edition, but the new paperback in the US at least is not coming out until November 8th. I know Tor UK is also taking over this book for a traditionally published UK release, but I'm not sure what their timetable is for the UK release or if that's already happened. And then last but not least, on November 15th from Saga Press, we have Tread of Angels by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is a novella. I have no idea if it's going to be a standalone or a first in a series. I have read the first books in each of Roanhorse's 2 series, and I've not continued on with either of them yet. So part of me is like really hoping this is a standalone so I can like read something of Rebecca Roanhorse's and like finish it and be done with it. This is a fantasy western or weird western with like demons or maybe other paranormal beings. There is possibly a murder. This is being described as a dark fantasy. I'm not really sure what to expect from this, but it looks very different from her previous 2 series, and I am intrigued. So there you have it. That is the end of my very long list of the SFF books that I am looking out for in the second half of the year. Let me know if you're looking forward to any of these or if you have other hotly anticipated releases on your radar. I noticed I don't have anything for December, which is not super unusual. December is usually a slow release month, but given that I had so many books on this list, I'm a little surprised that there was nothing for December. Anyways, tell me if there are any books you're looking forward to in December. Anyhow, I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.